exhibit to sort of tell the story of the young people, of the children who have been killed, who were killed in Gaza during the last reign of terror. And they did that without the leadership from Katie, so that was a very positive step forward. We only have Katie half-time. She spends 1 day a week in Omaha, or in Des Moines, and 2 days in Omaha working with the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and also setting up Students for Justice in Palestine. So there's work going on, and I just want to say there's a place for you in that work. We typically meet 1 day a month, and I will have to get your contact information because it's been a busy week, and I really apologize. I don't have a handout for you. But anyways, there's a role for you with this work with the American Friends Service Committee. So, and I'm sure there is with the UMC. So, that being said, please, I look forward to being in touch with you. And then I wanted to introduce Rabbi Brant Rosen, who is the Midwest Regional Director for the American Friends Service Committee. He's been in this position for about 10 months, I guess. But he brings a lot of wisdom to the work, and we're delighted to have him here. And I try and get him for 3 days. I got him for half a day. So, and that's all because we had executive committee meeting. But they keep him busy. But Brant, if you would come up and share your piece of your wisdom with him. Thank you.
Oops. Having technical issues. You just got to show that thing who's boss. Nope.
Yes, I was a synagogue handyman. Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Christine. I'm not going to lead on this. And thank you all for coming. I know some of you here. I'm looking forward to getting to know more of you. It's always a pleasure to visit Des Moines in particular. I think you have a wonderful and remarkable community of social justice activists that's quite venerable, and it's really an honor for me to get to know you and to participate together with you on issues such as this. I'm going to follow Christine's lead and share with you a little bit about my own faith journey on this issue, and in particular to underline why in the world a rabbi is doing Palestine solidarity work and working for the American Friends Service Committee, and how I came to this place that feels actually very natural to me, and in many ways allows me to be my authentic spiritual and political self. And I think also part of a growing constituency in the Jewish community that is starting to find the courage of our convictions on this issue and do this work. I grew up in a pretty average middle class, upper middle class Jewish family. I grew up in Los Angeles, went to a Reform temple growing up, and I would say that for me, my own spiritual vision is not really that different from Christine's. You know, what Christine said refracted through her faith tradition really resonates for me. The God that I know and the spiritual tradition that I'm a part of, for me, has always demanded that I stand with the oppressed and stand up against the oppressor. And that was instilled in me as a Jew from a very early age. The central mythic spiritual story of Jewish tradition is the Exodus from Egypt. And the central lesson of that story is that God demands the liberation of the enslaved and the oppressed, and demands that we stand up to the pharaohs of this world. And the way that this lesson was instilled in me is that this is not only talking about Israelites, it's not only just talking about Jews. There are so many peoples throughout the world who could be considered God's people in this regard. So that universal ethic, I think, universal Jewish ethic, was very much a part of my own upbringing. environment, my parents, my family, the community I was a part of, was very proud of the Jewish involvement in liberation movements and the civil rights movement and movements of social change. And to me, it was always the natural way to understand being Jewish is the central directive is to stand up for change, particularly when it comes to the most vulnerable members of our community. And I think I was very mindful that the Jewish historical experience gave us a unique insight into this and a unique sense of purpose. For a people that has been oppressed for so many centuries, to have a tradition that says, do not oppress the stranger because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. That is the most oft repeated commandment in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible. I think on a historical level, that lesson is all the more important, that a people that has had more than its share of oppression, has experienced more than its share of prejudice and anti-Semitism in the many countries in which we've lived, it's an imperative to us to take that experience and not allow it to embitter us against the world, or to use our victimization as a weapon against the world, but rather to use it as a tool for empathy and for healing and for standing up for all those who are oppressed. So that has always been part and parcel of my own Jewish spiritual identity and historical identity. What makes it complicated is that alongside of all of that, I grew up in an environment, in a normative Jewish environment that saw the state of Israel as also part and parcel of my primary Jewish identity, as it is for many, many, many Jews. I grew up accepting that the Jewish state was necessary, that Zionism, in other words, Jewish political nationalism, was this miraculous narrative of a people who rose from the ashes of one of the worst catastrophes and tragedies in our history to finally become a Am Chofshi Be'artzenu, as Israel's national anthem would have it, a free people on our own land. That narrative is a powerful and compelling narrative, and that was also instilled in me from the very beginning. I have family members in Israel on my father's side. I first visited Israel when I was 8 or 9, and have visited many more times than I can count. And I identified, as many Jews do, very powerfully with the state of Israel. And as you might imagine, those two identifications have often been in conflict with one another. And for most of my life, I did a good job of just keeping the conflict shelved away and didn't really deal with it. Didn't really deal with the questions of what does it mean to grow up with a spiritual tradition that teaches that we must stand against the oppressor, and identify so deeply with this heavily militarized society that is in a constant state of war all the time. What does it mean to be involved in the peace movement and to be involved in the anti-war movement, but at the same time make exceptions when Israel behaves in certain ways? So that's a cognitive dissonance that I think I've had for most of my life. And to make a long story short, I think it got to the point where I was unable to just shelve those voices, those conflicting voices in the back of my psyche anymore. It became increasingly complicated when I decided to become a rabbi, as you might imagine, because as a rabbi, this wasn't just my issue, right? I mean, for your average Jew on the street, there isn't much consequence when one individual is wrestling with these issues. But as a rabbi of a congregation where I have literally hundreds of people who are looking to me to make sense of these issues for them, and where my words have very real weight to them and consequence to them, it's a much more difficult and thorny and complicated prospect. So I became a rabbi. I was ordained in the Reconstructionist movement, which I would say I could do a whole nother section on what is Reconstructionism, but I'll just say that it's a small denomination that emerged really out of the conservative movement. Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan was the founder of the movement, and he and his disciples ended up forming a separate denomination that I would say is on the more progressive end, probably maybe the most progressive end of the denominational Jewish spectrum. The Reconstructionist Rabbinical College where I went is in Philadelphia, where I studied for 5 years, and I became a pulpit rabbi, first in Denver and then in the Chicago area for the last 17 years. And as I said, it was dealing with the issue of Israel was very, very tough. And I think I dealt with it a number of ways. I dealt with it by saying, well, we need peace on all sides, which I think is the traditional liberal mantra, right? Just calling for people of good faith and people of peace and people who promote nonviolence to come together and find a way to coexist. Coexistence is an important piece of that mantra. And I don't want to be too dismissive of that. I did believe very deeply in it. During the early days of Oslo, there was very real hope in the world, and certainly in the Jewish community, when at a very brief moment in time when it seemed like a real peace might be possible. Those hopes were dashed, I think, relatively quickly. And I continued down that path for a number of years until eventually it became untenable for me personally. And the final breaking point for me was Operation Cast Lead, Israel's military onslaught on December 2008, January 2009. And I'm skipping over lots of little pieces along the way where I would struggle very deeply with the things Israel was doing, whether it was their increased settlements in the West Bank, whether it was land appropriation, whether it was the building of checkpoints on the wall, and so many of the things that Christine was describing to you. I started to visit the West Bank and see for myself what was going on. I started to meet Palestinians both in Palestine and in my home community, and really having my consciousness raised about what is the consequence of Israel's oppression. And I can say those words now, Israel's oppression, but it was not easy for me, I think for many Jews, to really understand the situation in those terms. I think many liberal Jews will say, or many liberals will say, well, it's a conflict, and it's been going on from time immemorial, and we have two sides who are battling over basically rights in the same piece of land, and the only answer is to find a way to negotiate and to share it. And it became clear to me that that's not an accurate paradigm of what's going on. It just isn't. What is going on, what I believe in my heart, what is going on is a colonial movement that came to this land to create a Jewish state, a ethnically Jewish state, in a land that has been historically multi-ethnic and multi-religious. And naturally, conflict ensued. And as that conflict ensued, Israel, first the Zionists who settled the land, and later the land of Israel, the state of Israel, the governments of Israel, tried to exert their power and their control over this land with increasing violence and force in order to control the people who happen to not be Jewish, who happen to live on that land. And to me, one of the central problems of Zionism itself, and I go farther than saying that this is just an issue of policies of any given Israeli government, but I believe the crux of the issue is in the ideology of ethnic nationalism that is predicated on keeping a majority of one kind of people in this land in order to maintain this state. In order to have a Jewish state, you need a majority of Jews. And if you need a majority of Jews, that means the presence of non-Jews is by definition a problem that you have to deal with. And that was always a conundrum that I had that I could never wrap myself around. But finally, during Operation Cast Lead, when I read what Israel was doing from the very early days of that military assault, it finally became clear to me that this is not a conflict. This is not about rockets coming out of Gaza and Israel trying to defend itself. This is about a state trying to exert its power and control and domination over another people. And so I was blogging at the time. I started a blog several years before, and I wrote very strongly, finally, about how I felt about what was going on. And I called it an outrage, and I said these were war crimes, and I'm tired of apologizing for Israel. And then I wrote, now I've said it. Then I wrote, now what do I do? And at the time, that statement was sort of, I think, misunderstood by a lot of people who read it. I think I got back a lot of comments on my blog saying, well, you should march in this march and sign this petition and go to this, go to this action. And really, for me, that question was much more of an existential question. I was really asking, well, if I'm breaking with this narrative that's been a central part of my Jewish identity for my entire life, now what am I? What can I continue to be a rabbi? Can I continue to be a Jew? Where is my community? And it was just one of those moments where I saw a path that I needed to go down and put myself out there with the trust that there would be a way out, or maybe a way in at long last. So actually, quite remarkably, my congregation, as you might imagine, it raised a fair amount of dust inside my congregation and in the community as a whole. That was when I started to get involved with an organization that I'm sure many of you know about, Jewish Voice for Peace, who I thank goodness for. I had friends who were part of Jewish Voice for Peace who were waiting patiently for me. And it has then and has since become an incredibly important political and spiritual Jewish home for me and for many, many others, many other Jews and people who are not Jewish as well. But I would also say that at the time, my congregation, quite bravely, or at least the leadership of the congregation, stood by me. They didn't necessarily agree with what I was saying, and some of them were, I think, even offended by what I was saying, but their attitude was not, well, the rabbi has gone off the deep end, this isn't the rabbi we hired 10 years ago. Their attitude was more something like, okay, well, we have a situation here, and how are we going to deal with it? How are we going to deal with this new reality? And I think many of them understood that part and parcel of a rabbi or any clergy's job is to speak their conscience, and even if it takes us collectively to uncomfortable places. And I think, Christine, I resonate with your message as well, that you see this road and you have to go down it. I think, and I think you have to trust that there will be those who will be willing to go down with you. So, go down the road, rather. Go down with you. Go down. Gotta be careful what metaphors I use.
Yeah.
So, I started to go down that road, and it made life very challenging in the congregation, but I give my congregation a lot of credit for really struggling through it with me. Probably the high point for me, and maybe as a congregational rabbi, the highest point, I think will always be, I took a group of congregants to the West Bank where we stayed in refugee camps, we stayed in the homes of Palestinians, we met with civil society activists, and they were literally willing to go with me and see these things up close. And it was devastating. I think had a similar kind of impact as what Christine was describing on many of them. And in the end, it just became too untenable for me to continue. There was always a small number of members of my congregation for whom my Palestine solidarity activism was just too painful. And I understand it, as hard as it was for me. If you think about it, if you are Jewish and Israel is at the center of your Jewish identity, and your rabbi is saying and doing these things, it causes you great pain. you're to be associated with him and to be part of the community that he leads. And I think I was in some ways naive to think that I could deal with that pain indefinitely. And so, to make a long story short, it eventually created an intolerable situation where I just was not able to do my job fully as a rabbi anymore. I had been in my congregation in Evanston for 17 years, and decided last summer of 14, to step down. And shortly after, some dear friends who happened to work at the American Friends Service Committee reached out to me and said, you know, we have no idea if this is at all anything you'd be interested in, but we're looking for a new Midwest regional director, and we think you'd be, you know, wonderful. And the man who for many years was the regional director of the Great Lakes region, which eventually became the Midwest region, was a man named Michael McConnell, who some of you may know, who was a friend and colleague of mine as well for many years, who was very visionary, very much a leader in the Chicago social justice community, particularly in the area of immigrant justice and sanctuary. And he was also a UCC minister, and he made that position. He proved, I think, that you could be a spiritual leader and a political activist and a person of conscience and be UCC and Quaker, and you know, it was in many ways he was a role model for many people, but he certainly, when I contemplated making the shift from doing full-time congregational work to full-time activism work, it was largely Michael's role modeling. Michael tragically passed away 3 years ago now. But it was something I was able to envision largely because of his example, and also because of people who were my colleagues in AFSC, and not only in the Chicago office. Kathleen McQuillan brought me out here to Des Moines while I was still a humble congregational rabbi, and I got to know people in the Des Moines community through her. And so AFSC is one of those organizations that is ubiquitous. They're like always there. You turn around and there's AFSC, and they're not only there next to you, they're like convening the community. They are I see AFSC as this spiritual institution that its genius is at bringing constituencies together and building community for social change in very active and important ways. And I know that because I've been part of those constituencies for many years. So I, without any lag time, left my congregation and became the regional director for AFSC. And what I would say is that, ironically enough, as a Jew, AFSC and its political and spiritual vision is allowing me to be my authentic self, really, in my work for the first time in my adult life. I can really be myself. I can write blog posts and speak at microphones and speak at rallies, and I don't have to censor myself anymore. I don't have to hold back. I don't have to worry about what this person is going to say to my synagogue president if I say it this way or that way. And there's something very liberating about being your authentic self. I think it's very important to build the environment in which you are able to be able to speak your truth without fear. And it's rare and it's precious, but it's taken a Quaker organization with a wonderfully interfaith spirit to allow me as a rabbi to discover my real voice. And so I'll just end by saying this summer I kicked off a little side project in my copious spare time. I was encouraged by many people. Some were former members of my congregation who left when I left, and others who were just mostly young millennials in Chicago who were Jewish social justice activists who I had cultivated relationships with over the years. Was encouraged to create a Jewish spiritual space that was focused on social justice and not on Jewish nation-statism. And so we had our first high holiday services just last month, and we're called Tzedek Chicago. Tzedek is the Hebrew word for justice, and we had about 300 people at our high holiday services. So I suspect that there are many out there who are looking to become their authentic selves and find their authentic voice as well. I know that, and I've known that in my heart, and now I know it to be true because I saw it with my own eyes. So that gives me hope. Christine ended on a note of hope, and I will as well, that I think we are moving in a more hopeful direction. It doesn't always seem like that when we read the news, but I also do believe that both from my faith tradition, as what our faith traditions teach us, but also my own theory of change and political analysis of the situation is that that we are moving toward a place of justice and a place of liberation, and we are building that movement together, and it's an honor to be part of that with all of you. So thank you again for having me. I look forward to continuing the struggle together with all of you. Question answer?
Yeah, I was gonna say, all right, with Q&A, both of you?
What are your thoughts about what's happening over there right now?
Read my blog. I think what's going on over there is tragic, it's horrible and tragic, and I think it was inevitable. I think that sometimes I wonder why it's taken this long for something like this to happen. Again, I go back to the paradigm by which I understand what's going on there. I don't see this as a conflict, between two peoples who are committing violence against each other. I see Israel as the power in power, as an entity that has been committing state violence against Palestinians for decades. And when you oppress a people through state violence, they will invariably resist. Often that resistance will be violent. That we know this. We've seen this happen time and time again. So while I believe in nonviolence, philosophically speaking, I think we have to understand the context as one of oppression. And we can't equate or see this as a situation of parity in any way. It's an inherently a situation of inherent imbalance. And I think the answer is not to condemn Palestinians for inciting violence and for committing acts of terror, quote unquote. I think the answer is not, as the liberal narrative would have it, that why can't we all just get along? Yeah. I think the answer is to hold Israel to account and to point out that as long as it continues to create a context of violence every single day that Palestinians live under, these acts of violence will be inevitable. And that's what needs to be addressed, is the inherent injustice and oppression that's going on every day. If you spend time in the West Bank, it's hard to describe to anyone who's never been there, but Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank, and all the more so in places like Gaza, in a place like Gaza, it's a context of violence. These families live every day in a heavily militarized world where violence is the air they breathe. They go through checkpoints every single day. They have to encounter soldiers with M16s patrolling their streets and their public areas every single day. They have to deal with violent settlers who attack them with impunity, often under the watchful eyes of the Israeli military every single day. So even when there aren't physical acts of violence being committed, there is an atmosphere of violence that Israel is creating through the occupation and through its military presence. And people who have never experienced that or seen that, and I've seen it, and I can't say I've experienced it. I mean, I wouldn't dare to say that, but I certainly understand when I read in the paper what's going on there. And as I said, I wonder at the patience of a people who have been taking it for this long without doing this every single day, quite frankly.
agree. I agree.
Would either of you talk about, the US role in this, and why should people sitting in Des Moines, Iowa, come up to hear about this? There's lots of violence in the world. Why do we have a role here?
Oh, okay. You know, I didn't really think much about the U.S. role in this conflict until I started doing some reading and some studying. And I believe that a lot of this is due to guilt. That a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans have a lot of guilt over what happened during the Holocaust. And that was a terrible thing. No people should have to go through that and experience that. But that does not then give you the right to become the oppressor. The United States government gives $10 million every day to Israel for arms. Every time I saw a bunch of 18 or 19-year-old soldiers standing on a street corner with a big gun hanging off of their side, I thought, oh, I bet I paid for that gun. So it's very disturbing to me to think that without asking any questions or asking the government to be accountable for what they're receiving, seems to me to be just nonsense, that we have to step up and say, you know, what is that money being used for? We know what it's being used for, but a lot of our representatives don't seem to want to admit that. And I think a lot of them are just afraid to stand up because they appear to be then anti-Semitic. As soon as you call anything into question, you know, oh, you're anti-Semitic. And I think there's a big difference between being against the Jewish faith and being against Israeli government policy. To me, those are two different things. And I think we need to be taking a serious look at Israeli government policy and what we're doing in the United States to support that reign of terror, basically, for Palestinians.
I agree with that. I would add that I think we need to understand this in the broader context of America, our government trying to extend its influence and promote its interests in this part of the world in particular, not only, but this part of the world in particular, often at the expense of so many of the people who actually live there. So I think we should be asking the same questions about American support for Egypt, the Egyptian regime, and for the Saudi Arabian regime. We should be asking those same questions about American foreign policy and American military aid across the board. I think what makes Israel unique are many of the things that Christine was saying. And as a Jew, I find it troubling that governments of Israel can play this anti-Semitism card so deftly and so cynically, that often really plays into the actual designs of real anti-Semites. That's a part that I have a very, very hard time with as a Jew. That Israel, on a certain level, and it sounds perverse, but I think it's very true, Israel needs anti-Semitism to legitimate itself. Israel was created out of the necessity to build a Jewish safe haven in an anti-Semitic world. That's the ideology of Zionism, going back to Theodor Herzl, the father of political Zionism, all the way up to Netanyahu, who talks about the world like it's just the most unsafe place for Jews. And he plays on those memes so expertly and so cynically that I find, as a Jew, someone who needs Jews to be unsafe to promote his political ends I find to be repulsive. But that goes down to the notion of, I think, what it means not only be a Jew, but a citizen in the world. Do we see the world as an inherently unsafe place where we need to literally build walls between us and those around us? Or do we believe in diplomacy and engagement and in reaching out? I mean, what's the way out of fear? And I think in more fearful times, such as the post 9/11 world that we live in, I think too often it's the garrison mentality that tends to predominate. So I think, we need to work on changing the narrative that promotes what we in the American Friends Service Committee call the shared security. That real security, that we take the mantle of security away from the hawks and say, no, shared security is about reaching out and collaborating together and not fomenting war around the world to feel safer, but really, when it comes down to it, is all about promoting our own designs in the world.
Well, they have given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate it, but I do want to find out if there are any other questions before we move on. No,
I just want to make a comment. I think that we get numb by money, millions and billions. And I had explained to me, one time, 1 second equals $1. 1 million seconds is 12 days. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. If you keep in mind what those millions and billions and trillions, they really are a lot of money.
Yes.
And maybe, Rada Rose, you'd like to give your thoughts on this as well, but I probably think it's one step further in that even though Israel doesn't consciously promote anti-Semitism, it, in a sense, by trying to equate any opposition to Israel's policy with anti-Semitism, in a sense, it's lending legitimacy because if someone is against injustice, they're against Israel's policies, and then they're trying to say, well, like Netanyahu went to the world and said, well, I speak for the Jews, I speak for all of you. Right? And he has this kind of attitude, so they're actively promoting. The other thing that promotes it is if you commit crimes in the name of Jews, you're sitting there, you demolish people's homes, you massacre entire villages like in Deir Yassin historically, Yisrael Shatila, we bomb Gaza, they commit so many horrific crimes. The list is on and on and on. And then on top of that you say, okay, I speak for you. I just left your driver's license at the crime scene. I'm your best friend. That's actively promoting anti-Semitism and smearing everybody who's Jewish. It smears our name, and it's insulting.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I find some hope, though, that I think Netanyahu, I don't want to make this all about Netanyahu, because I think he's like the tip of the iceberg in some ways, but I think he overplayed his cards with the Iran deal. And he also overplayed his cards when it came to when there were acts of anti-Semitism and violence that occurred in France and other parts of Europe. And he went to France to basically tell French Jews to flee for their lives to Israel, the safe place of Israel. And there was, I don't know if any of you saw when he went to speak to the main synagogue in Paris. And as he was finishing, all the Jews stood up and sang the French national anthem and drowned him out.
Yep.
La Marseillaise. And so I think there are hopeful signs that Judaism, to me, I've come to realize the beauty of Judaism is that it is this global movement. The diaspora, Jews would not have come into being had it not been for the diaspora. Judaism, as we know it, came into being after the destruction of the Second Temple, and Jews were then living throughout the world, and they reconstructed Judaism to adapt to very different historical circumstances and cultural circumstances, and that global identity has really been the secret of not only our survival, but I think our creativity and our spiritual, what makes us so spiritually unique. And to then reduce it all to this territorially based nationalistic movement that tries to speak on behalf of all Jews everywhere and sees the diaspora as this horrible, dangerous place, I think is deeply not only problematic, I think it perverts what makes our tradition so sacred in the first place. So, yes, I refuse to be guilty by association. I think there are many, many more Jews who react very viscerally when leaders like Netanyahu try to speak in the name of all Jews everywhere. So I think I would agree with what you're saying.
I was wondering, like, in Iowa we have a lot of influence and voice at this time during leading up to the caucuses. And in the last Democratic debate, the topic of foreign policy was pretty much ignored. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on how we can get presidential candidates to talk more about issues like this and
bird dog them. They need to be asked those hard questions directly. At a recent Bernie Sanders event, I'm not sure where it was, some activists from SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, held up the banner that said, "Will you feel the burn for Palestine?" So you heard about this, and they were
That picture's
Okay,
that
so-
picture's gone viral on Facebook.
Yeah, and they were forcibly asked to leave by a staffer. What was interesting was the campaign fired that staffer, repudiated her, and this issue went viral. And so I think we have to hold them accountable because the moderators of debates are not going to do it, and the mainstream media is not going to do it. And in Iowa, you have a golden opportunity where you have these candidates just literally showing up on your doorstep every day. And that is an opportunity for the next several months where this light is just shining to put these questions to them and demand answers. I mean, foreign policy is the great leveler, This is where they all come together, and it's, for someone like Bernie Sanders who voted against the Iraq War, it's, I think, particularly disappointing that now that he's running for president, will fall in line with all the others. Their responses to what's been going on in Israel-Palestine lately has been hugely, hugely disheartening, where they're just mourning the loss of Israelis and not Palestinians. But I guess they've determined that Palestinians are not an important voting bloc. So I would only say just, dog them and make sure that they hear from you and that they are forced to answer these questions. Katie, did you want to?
Just to elaborate on the Bernie Sanders, I'm a great student with the Students for Justice in Palestine conference. We were there over last weekend, and we met with him, and we actually sat down and kind of mapped out what a plan and formalized actually with the support of JVP, and hopefully we can collaborate with it if we don't, obviously. But and I think we came up with a really kind of targeted Bernie Sanders, specifically on Bernie Sanders to bring the issue of Palestine, kind of taking the bird dogging, but exactly what the Bernie for them also. Great students, including Emma, are very much part of that and are developing with the gentleman who did it in the video.
we just had a conference call yesterday.
Yeah. And we have,
The settlement people have gotten a lot of support from the far right Christians, thinking that John Hagee, the evangelist from Texas, has given millions of dollars in building settlements there. And I think, we need to be aware of this, and all because of the thinking that the second coming of Jesus is going to take place in a violent way. And I don't go along with that thinking. I just wondered if you, what
and
you
that's-
have to comment.
That's why, there is I think, a kind of a perverse interfaith deal between Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists, and that we need to model a different kind of interfaith approach, which is that we come together bound by the common vision that Christine and I have been saying, that we believe in the God who stands with the oppressed. And I think we are building that coalition. We don't have the kind of government support and lobbying muscle and financial support that Christian Zionists and the Israel advocacy movement in general has. But I think the fact that Israel, the government of Israel and supporters of Israel are reacting so violently to the BDS boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and that they've labeled it now that the Iran deal is done, the new boogeyman is BDS. And Netanyahu and the government of Israel have labeled BDS public enemy of Israel #1. And you're seeing a huge backlash against BDS activists, and students in SJP know this firsthand. We need to come together to be emboldened and see this as a sign of hope. That the backlash means that our message is getting across and they understand how powerful we can be. So I would suggest modeling a different kind of interfaith collaboration.
We have just heard Rabbi Brad Rosen speaking.
Well, thanks to each of you for being here today. Thank you, Christine, for providing the space, and Christine and Brant for being here and sharing their witness and their story. I want to announce one event coming up. We touched on the role of money. We touched on the idea of weapons around the world and how much we're spending on weapons for Israel. Please join us Wednesday night at Drake University, and thank you for signing our sheet. I've got your email, so I'll remind you at 7 o'clock, Drake University, Olin Building. We're having a former colonel, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was an aide, chief of staff to Colin Powell, 31-year military man. He's talking about our foreign policy is driven by the weapons industry. So if this is something we've begun to think about, and it's part of our campaign that AFSC is doing called Governing Under the Influence. And we're trying to draw attention to the fact that our policies, our prison policies, our weapons policies, our detention, immigration policies are really being driven by the profit motive of private corporations. So I hope you can come and join us. I'll send some emails to you to remind you. Wednesday, 7 o'clock, Drake University. And thank you so much for being here.
The Olin building is a black one on the campus.
Okay, that's where it's being held.
Yep. Again, and that was Rabbi Brad Rosen, and this is the third time I streamed him. I apologize for the hiccups at the beginning. I was having some signal issues and had interrupted, but I'll put this up on YouTube when I get home. I'll have to properly title it because I didn't get the event right, but anyway, so again, I will bring you that event next Wednesday. I will go stream that from Drake University, and that should be quite interesting. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the stream.